Episode 1, Superpowers, Changes Over Time, and Superpowers Theories. This audiobook will cover the first 6 lessons from the Superpowers topic. Information was procured from the Superpowers booklet, worksheets, and PowerPoint presentations. Lesson 1, An Introduction to Superpowers. A superpower is a nation with the ability to project its influence anywhere in the world and be a dominant global force. Power, both economic and political, is unevenly distributed and changes over time. Some nations have disproportionate influence over decision-making. This may be regional or global. Other nations and people have very limited influence. Some nations gain power over time, whilst others lose it. By consequence, the geography of power has changed over time and continues to change. Countries with a large land area are important because they tend to have greater natural resources and can extend influence over a larger number of neighbors. Russia, for example, is the world's largest country with enormous volumes of natural resources. It also has 14 neighbors over whom it is able to extend varying degrees of influence. Countries with a large military may be viewed to be more powerful. However, the type of weapons owned is also representative of power. Countries in possession of nuclear weapons, namely the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, Israel, have tactical advantages that dictates foreign policy and doctrine. The threat of military action is a powerful bargaining chip, and the deployment of military force can be used to achieve geopolitical goals. The removal of Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq in 2003 is an excellent example of this. Countries with the largest economies have a significant global influence. The world's 12 largest economies are based in the United States, Japan, China, India, South Korea, Brazil, UK, France, Canada, Germany, Italy, and Russia. These 12 countries collectively earn around 2/3 of world GDP. They can control investment and use the world's most powerful currencies. They can also determine economic policies which affect the globe. Economic power is a prerequisite of power and gives nations the wealth to build and maintain a powerful military, to exploit and import natural resources, and to export their cultural power around the world. Countries with a large population are seen as important because larger populations encourage economic growth through market. This includes the European Union. Cheap workers from emerging countries like China and India can help to promote economic growth. Larger populations can also support a large military. However, some countries, such as Singapore, have managed to promote significant economic growth without a large population, especially by attracting skilled migrants. Countries with access to the natural resources necessary for economic development should hold significant power. Russia, for instance, has gas. The Middle East has oil, and China has rare earth minerals. However, countries with significant resources are not necessarily powerful because exporting raw materials adds little value to the economy. This is the case for Australia and its iron ore. Moreover, TIs control large volumes of resource and human resources, such as the level of education and skills of a nation, are also important. The spread of culture around the world, including traditions, ways of life, beliefs, music, fashion, and food, can significantly impact a country's soft influence, often referred to as Westernization. Europe and the USA export their cultural ideals around the world. This is symbolized by the ubiquity of teensy logos, such as Starbucks and Ford. McDonald's, for example, serves 65 million customers daily, which amounts to approximately 750 people per second. Political power refers to a country's ability to influence others through diplomacy. The aim is to persuade others to their point of view. Political power is exercised primarily through intergovernmental organizations, such as the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. A country that has a large number of allies and is a part of many multilateral agreements will tend to wield a large amount of power. Lesson 2. How and why do superpowers change over time? The terms hard and soft power were coined in 1990 by political scientist Joseph Nye, although both forms of power have existed for centuries. Hard power refers to power through force or coercion, likely to involve military power or economic sanctions. Soft power, on the other hand, involves exerting influence through favor or persuasion, and is likely to involve cultural power. This makes countries follow your lead due to your attractive and appealing policies. The power spectrum outlines 3 different types of power. Hard power involves military action or the threat of it, economic sanctions such as trade restrictions, diplomatic sanctions like the expulsion of diplomats and the cutting of political ties, the creation of military alliances to marginalize some nations. Soft power involves political influence. An example of this would be if a country took a leading role in climate change talks, the signing favorable trade agreements to increase economic ties, moral authority over a country's foreign policy, and perhaps even cultural attractiveness. Economic power sits right in the middle and has many overlaps with both hard and soft power. A notable example of this would be coercive policies and tied aid or trade agreements. In reality, however, the most successful countries combine hard with soft power to achieve smart power. Soft and hard power are best seen as a spectrum rather than as poles. Geostrategic policies involves the use of geography to achieve political goals. This extends to the control of raw materials such as oil, the movement of armies and navies, the colonization of new territories, and the establishment of air bases. The Mackinder's heartland theory suggests that whoever controlled Eastern Europe, the heartland, would control the world. The idea was that whoever gained control of Eastern Europe controlled the heartland, also known as the pivot area, could easily gain control of the world island, Africa, and Eurasia. Lots of powerful countries are in or near the heartland. Peripheral countries such as Australia, New Zealand, South American, African countries are not as powerful. Nazi Germany thought the same and tried to take over heartland. Russia is similarly trying to take over Ukraine. That's it for strengths, however. The USA is arguably the largest superpower today, and the theory does not take into account globalization and the transport, communications, military and internet improvements that have made because of this. The British Empire wanted to control strategic areas of land to secure trade routes and access to raw materials. Nazi Germany believed that occupying other countries was a logical and vital way to ensure Lebensraum, or living space. After World War II, the USA adopted a policy of containment of the USSR and China in order to try to limit the spread of communism. NATO continues the US policy of containment today in Eastern Europe against Russia. Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 from Ukraine and invaded Ukraine in 2022. China has been expanding its military and has set out to build artificial islands in the South China Sea. Lesson 3. The British Empire. A unipolar world is a world dominated by one superpower or hyperpower. A bipolar world is a world divided by 2 opposing power blocks. A multipolar world involves numerous relationships between more or less equally powerful states. The British Empire was the largest empire in history. By 1922, the British Empire controlled over 458 million people, 25 the world's population, and covered 25 of its land area. In 1914, Britain's navy was the largest in the world and double the size of the next largest, that of Germany. The empire developed as Britain needed to obtain raw materials processed so that goods could be manufactured in the UK, to add value and trade, to secure trade routes and markets, and to extend political power and beliefs. Raw materials could be cheaply obtained from Africa and sold for profit. This increased Britain's power. Millions of enslaved people were forced to grow and harvest raw materials such as cotton. This supported industrialization. Industrialization enabled processing of raw materials, which could then be sold back to the countries selling the materials, causing huge profit. Industrialization gave Britain economic power. Few countries could compete with the British Empire's military power. There were 100,000 men in the Royal Navy. Britain did not take direct control of India until 1858. Before this Britain, France, Portugal and the Dutch all had trading posts in India. They exported tea, spices and opium. Britain expanded into Southeast Asia, namely Burma, Malaysia and Singapore, from bases in India. In 1857, there was a major uprising against British influence in India. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. British forces took full control of India in 1858. After 1858, the British Crown continued to extract vast wealth from India, imposing heavy taxes and promoting cash crop agriculture. The British used a policy of divide and rule to maintain control, which exacerbated religious and social tensions. The rail network was expanded. This made trade easier and quicker and helped the military to quell unrest. There was a policy of promoting the English language and British culture. British judicial systems and educational systems were set up. British sports such as cricket and traditions such as tea drinking were introduced. In 1947, India became independent from British rule. It was the first country to gain independence from Britain after World War II. Feelings of nationalism were growing in strength, and popular uprisings demanded independence. Following World War II, Britain was short of the money needed to run its empire, and people were more focused on post-war reconstruction at home. Most former colonies became independent by 1970. Lesson 4. How have patterns of power changed over time? After the Second World War, two global superpowers emerged, the USA and the USSR. The Cold War was a conflict without fighting. The USA, believing in capitalism, was opposed to the Soviet Union's communist government. In order to become more powerful, the USSR took advantage of collapsed countries in Eastern Europe, such as Poland and Hungary, and enforced a communist regime. This enabled them to have a buffer zone, protecting them from direct attack. These countries were heavily defended along their western borders, which became known as the Iron Curtain. The Cold War did not lead to direct military confrontation between the two superpowers. However, as each sought to increase their influence, there were flashpoints of increased tension and indirect or proxy conflicts. This includes the Korean War in 1950, 51, 52, and 53, as well as the Berlin Wall, which existed from 1961 up until 1989. The USSR broke up in 1991 as its political systems collapsed. The USA emerged in the 1990s as the only superpower in a unipolar world. In 1985, the newly elected President Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, Russian for freedom of speech and the private ownership of small businesses. USSR was hit by economic failure and food shortages in the late 1980s. It couldn't afford to keep up with USA in the arms race. It had lost money in the war in Afghanistan and elsewhere, providing military assistance and aid to countries opposing to countries opposing USA. From 1881 to 1991, and with their newfound freedom, states within the USSR rebelled and claimed their own sovereignty, independence, after independence, and the breakup of the USSR, they became known as FCC's former communist countries. The USA as a superpower. By 1900, the USA had taken over from Britain as the world's largest economy. It had a wealth of natural resources, oil, coal, and one of the world's most productive arable areas. The US dollar was the world's major currency by 1950, and 60 of all global bank reserves were held in dollar. Today, The USA produces over 25% of global GDP. The Second World War stimulated the US economy as a result of wartime production, and unlike Europe, it did not suffer from destruction of infrastructure. The USA provided the goods and finance to help rebuild Europe after the devastation of the war. This was known as the Marshall Plan, with a total of $17 billion invested to support the policy of containment. It was not just economic strength. The USA exerted political power by encouraging the establishment of international institutions and international law. The United Nations headquarters were located in New York, and the World Bank and IMF were based in Washington. The spread of communism throughout Eastern Europe, China and Korea in the mid to late 1940s caused shockwaves in the USA. They created a policy of containment with the goal being to surround communist countries with capitalist allies to prevent their ideology spreading. By the mid-1950s, American money was pouring into India and Southeast Asia to prevent further communist expansion. Their aim was to help those countries close to communist areas where war damage had brought economic collapse. All are now major economies. The fight against communism dominated US foreign policy until the collapse of the USSR in 1991. US large-scale air and land campaigns during the war set precedent for the global projection of US military strength. The military alliance NATO, an acronym for the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, was formed in 1949, which allied the USA with Western European capitalist countries in the event of an attack by the USSR. US nuclear weapons were installed in friendly allies and aimed at the USSR as a nuclear deterrent against Soviet aggression. Today, the USA has by far the world's largest and most technologically advanced fleet of warplanes, ships, tanks, and artillery systems, giving it dominance over air, sea, and land. Control of space and information are key aspects of US military strategy for the 21st century. The US defense industry employs over 2 million people, and US military spending accounts for 45% of the global total. In terms of cultural power, the growth of media such as Hollywood and TNCs like McDonald's and Coca-Cola work to indirectly show off the wealth and advantages of capitalism. Another weapon was propaganda to show the evils of communism and benefits of capitalism. This era is referred to as the Red Scare, as fears grew over the perceived threats posed by the USSR. The USSR as a superpower. By 1921, the year before the formation of the USSR, Russia had been wrecked by the effects of the First World War, the 1917 Revolution, and the following Civil War. Millions of Russians had been killed and injured since 1914, and the continuing political unrest had caused production to collapse, devastating the economy. People were starving in the cities. Yet 20 years later, in 1941, when Germany invaded, the USSR was able to hold out, and it also had the world's second largest economy, having overtaken Britain. Stalin, the Soviet leader from 1922 to 1953, was aware of anti-communist hostility across Europe, and he realized that USSR's only hope of survival was military and industrial strength. Under a harsh authoritarian regime, a series of 5-year plans dramatically increased economic production and growth, all under state ownership. After 1945, the USSR competed with the USA in the space race and the arms race, and by 1949, they had developed their own nuclear weapons. In 1961, USSR beat the USA to put the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. By the 1960s, it was the world's second economic superpower, although its GDP was less than half that of the USA. A key focus of USSR's military strategy was to create a buffer zone of friendly communist countries in Central and Eastern Europe, known as satellite states. They also created a military alliance, the Warsaw Pact, in response to the creation of NATO, serving as a counterweight to Western military might. Communist propaganda was one of the main tools used by the USSR to control their citizens. Censorship was used to try to prevent people from discovering the wealth enjoyed by people under capitalism. Meanwhile, propaganda showed the evils of capitalism and the benefits of communism. Aid being offered by the US to Western European countries was frowned upon, and the Eastern satellite states were forbidden from applying for the aid. Instead, the USSR established Comecom, providing their own financial aid to keep the Eastern Bloc countries on side. The balance of power between the USA and USSR affected world geography. The USSR was keen to influence countries and promote communism. Eastern Bloc countries were technically independent, but indirectly ruled by USSR. During the 1970s, there was considerable Soviet influence within Africa, as well as countries in Central and South America. Military aid and assistance was provided, as well as financial aid to enable countries to develop their raw materials. The world changed dramatically following the collapse of communism. The process was rapid and pivoted around the key public event of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. This wall had long symbolized the political separation of the Cold War superpowers. The cultural and economic hegemony of the USSR disintegrated overnight. The USSR was finally dissolved in 1991. Neocolonialism is used to describe a situation where wealthy former colonial powers control the world economy in such a way that they benefit and less wealthy former colonies lose out. The wealthy countries buy raw materials for low prices from the former colonies and sell them manufactured goods at high prices. The wealthy countries control investment, loans and aid. Direct political control is decreased, but economic control is increased. Lesson 5. Emerging Powers. The acronym BRIC was coined by Jim O'Neill in 2001. It refers to the grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The first BRICS summit was held in 2009, and a year later, South Africa joined the BRICS. These counties account for 47% of the world population and 32 to 36% of global GDP. They are working together to tackle climate change. They intend to incite UN Security Council reform and are collectively fighting poverty. Brazil produces half of South America's GDP and can boast of having the largest fighting force in South America country with 330,000 military personnel. It has a population of 210 million, which gives it a large labor force. Its population is also quite young. Brazil has a global reputation as a footballing nation. It hosted the 2014 Football World Cup, as well as the 2016 Olympics and consequent Paralympics. It's also famous for Rio Carnival. These events boost economic growth through increased tourism. Brazil's biodiversity includes 13 of all known species and are especially prominent in the Amazon. It is the fifth largest country in the world and the largest country in South America. It shares its borders with 10 different neighboring countries. It also has huge natural resources and is self-sufficient in both food and energy. It's a globally significant producer of iron ore, biofuels, and HEP. It is, however, reliant on primary products for export. It has suffered numerous recessions which have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Its military is the least significant of the BRICs, and it does not have any nuclear weapons. Its population is also aging. China has the world's largest army with 2.2 million active military personnel, and it has the second largest defense budget after the USA. It's expected that its budget will catch up with the USA's by the mid-21st century. China lifted 500 million out of poverty between 1980 and 2010, and it now has the largest middle class in the world. China has the largest workforce in the world, with 800 million potential workers. China is a major player in global investment. Its state-run companies and banks all invest heavily overseas. For example, China General Nuclear Power Corps has taken a minority stake in the nuclear power project at Hinkley Point in Somerset, UK. China is also the biggest investor in renewable energies by a significant margin, and they produce double the amount of renewable energy as the USA. It is hoped that more than 90s of power will come from nuclear and renewables by 2050. 12 of Chinese are over 65. This is an aging population as a result of its former one-child policy in the 20th century, leading to a high dependency ratio and a large number of elderly to support. China and its workforce is isolated in terms of international migration, unlike the USA, which attracts global talent. Unlike the USA, China rarely gets involved in global crises, e.g. natural disasters, military or political crises, though it showed willingness to get involved in the COVID-19 pandemic response with vaccine diplomacy, as well as climate change with the Paris Agreement. China has few global brands and negligible impacts on global entertainment. It does have a large diaspora population with 10 million people living outside of their country of birth. This has helped to spread Chinese culture around the world. China is the world's largest CO2 emitter, producing just over a quarter of global emissions. They are aiming to reach peak carbon emissions by 2030 and carbon emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. But in 2022, they were still building 2 new coal-fired power stations per week. Russia is the 11th largest global economy. It has a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Russia is the largest country on Earth and has international borders with 14 neighboring countries. Some sources estimate that Russia contains over 30 of the world's natural resources. Russia is currently ranked second after the USA in terms of its military strength, with large numbers of weapons, including nuclear, and over 800,000 active military personnel, as well as more than 300,000 reserve personnel. They have also been increasing military activity in the Arctic to a level not seen since the Cold War. It's very dependent on oil and gas exports, producing half of its GDP, so it's vulnerable to global price fluctuations. As part of the USSR, it was a leading producer of electronics vehicles, food and medicines. However, manufacturing has since halved. There has been a reduction in Russia's global influence since 1991, although Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, has sought to rebuild it in recent years, including a substantial role in Syria between 2012 and 2017. A slump in oil prices and sanctions from the West following Russia's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 and invasion of Ukraine in 2022 have severely weakened its economy. Between 1991 and 2015 inclusive, Russia's population declined in 21 of the 25 years and has never recovered to its 1991 level. It also has an aging population. Russia has difficult diplomatic and geopolitical relationships with the EU and USA. Following the annexation of Crimea in 2014, they were excluded from the G8. Russia has a pollution legacy from industrialization between 1930 and 1960, which occurred with little concern about the damage caused by deforestation, mining, spillages, or toxic waste, and from the Chernobyl nuclear reactor explosion in 1986. Although military spending has increased, much of Russia's naval and aircraft stock is aging. Its one aircraft carrier dates from the Soviet era. The Indian economy is the 5th largest in the world, quadrupling in size between 1997 and 2015. India is the world's largest democracy. It was a founding member of the UN and of the G20 grouping of industrialized nations. India is the world's 7th largest country and shares borders with 7 neighboring countries. It has lots of natural resources such as coal and iron. Its economic advantages include an English-speaking education system and widespread use of English, facilitating the growth of outsourced industries in it, such as in Bengaluru. At 1.43 billion, India has the world's largest population, having just overtaken China. It has a youthful population, which will mean a huge working population in the medium to long term. India is ranked as the world's fourth largest military power in terms of weaponry and personnel. It is nuclear-armed, has sophisticated space and missile technology power, and has the second largest number of active personnel at 1.4 million. India is home to the world's largest film industry, Bollywood selling more cinema tickets globally than Hollywood films. However, it doesn't have Hollywood's global reach, and due to lower ticket prices, its revenue is perhaps 10 times less than Hollywood's. India has the largest diaspora population in the world, according to the UN, who estimated that 18 million people were living outside their country of birth. However, 15% of India's population is still living in poverty. Indian infrastructure is quite poor in both energy and water supply, as well as in transport, and it's a long way behind China. Power cuts are frequent. However, it has poor political relations with neighbors, especially Pakistan. India faces severe problems with water shortages, which are predicted to get worse. India has some serious air and water pollution issues, for example, in informal settlements such as Dharavi. India is the world's third largest emitter of CO2, though it has committed to the Paris Agreement and is currently the world's third largest producer of renewable energy. It has not yet committed to a carbon neutral target. Lesson 6. Superpower Theories. The modernization theory was developed by Rostow in the 1960s. It's based upon the experience of the British Empire and the UK, the home of the Industrial Revolution. Rostow believed the economies of developed countries moved through 5 stages of economic development and that all countries would follow this pathway, increasing their development and power. Stage 1. The traditional society, based on subsistence farming, fishing, forestry, and some mining. Technology is lacking and resources are undeveloped. Stage 2. Preconditions for takeoff. Conditions for takeoff include profits from farming and improving infrastructure, such as transport, energy, and communications. Stage 3. Takeoff. Better infrastructure, financial investment, and culture change as part of an industrial revolution. The introduction and rapid growth of manufacturing industries. Stage 4. The drive to maturity. New ideas and technology improve and replace older industries, and economic growth spreads through all sectors and areas of a country. Stage 5. High mass consumption. People have more wealth and so buy services and goods. In other words, they become consumers. Welfare systems are fully developed. Trade expands and consolidates links. Rostow believed in free trade and the Western model of democracy and capitalism, and believed that socialist and communist countries such as the USSR, Cuba, and at that time China could not expect to develop unless they adopted a capitalist approach. The theory led to many developing countries attempting to create the preconditions for takeoff by investing in key infrastructure, technology, education, and industries. The Asian tigers succeeded in this, but many other countries got themselves into further debt. The dependency theory is based on the work of G. Frank and views the world as having a developed core and underdeveloped periphery. In this theory, the capitalist core deliberately keeps the periphery in a state of underdevelopment, whilst the developing world in this way helps the developed world to become wealthier. Frank called this the development of underdevelopment. Manufactured goods, aid, political and economic ideas, and well as polluting industries, are exported from the core developed countries to the peripheral developing countries, who in turn export political support, raw materials, brain drain, and debt, as well as purchase payments. Based on idea of interdependence between capitalist core and underdeveloped periphery, the capitalist core keeps the periphery in a state of underdevelopment by exploiting its cheap resources, taking its most skilled workers, and selling it manufactured goods. The relationship makes the developed world even richer and more powerful, and the developing world relatively poorer and lacking in power. Aid is then needed to prevent the periphery from becoming restless. The world systems theory was developed by Wallerstein in 1974. It adds to the core periphery theory to make it dynamic, a three-tier world in which countries can move between periphery, semi-periphery, and core. Semi-peripheral countries are those where class struggle and social change takes place, such as Eastern Europe in the late 1980s, early 1980s NICs and RICs, ES and RICs. Cycles of growth and stagnation, which typify capitalist development, allow some countries to shift between the tiers, becoming more or less powerful, thereby leading to changing patterns of power over time. So, how have India and China grown in power? Rostow argues that Europe initiated industrial capitalism and that the rise of India and China is just another stage in the growth and spread of the global economy. Frank argues it's a shift back to an older world order where India and China were powerful economic forces. Wallerstein argues that capitalism necessarily incorporates cycles of growth and decline. These happen every 50 to 60 years and are known as Kondratiev cycles. The stagnation allows the restructuring of the world system, enabling the semi-periphery to become involved in the development process.